Hi, I'm Steve Clemons, and I have a question. President Trump got the tariffs that he's dreamt about for years, but how will it affect America and the world? Let's get to the bottom line. Well, promises made and promises kept. For the longest time, President Donald Trump has been telling everyone that to him, the most beautiful word in the dictionary is tariffs. Now his administration has announced that every single country in the world will have to pay an entry fee to sell its stuff in the United States. The customs tax range anywhere from more than 50% for China to 10% as a bare minimum for everyone. The president argued that he's ushering in the golden age of America, bringing jobs and factories to the United States after decades of outsourcing. But will it? What happens if the price of everything just goes up in the United States? And why, after 80 years of pushing globalization and free trade, is Washington making this U-turn now? Today, we're talking with Michael Strain, Director of Economic Policy Studies at the American Enterprise Institute, and he's author of The American Dream is Not Dead, but Populism Could Kill It. Michael, thank you so much for joining us today. Look, I think business leaders, world leaders, lots of folks didn't believe that President Trump was really going to come forward with something this robust when it comes to tariffs. Can you explain to our audience what happened, why it happened, and what the impact is going to be?
Well, sure, I can at least try. You know, what happened? President Trump, as you say, surprised everybody on the downside by announcing tariff increases that were much larger than were anticipated. The president announced a floor, a 10% across-the-board tariff on all imports. And then in addition to that, there will be additional tariffs that will be tailored to each country based on the White House's view of the trade imbalance the U.S. has with those individual countries. And so tariffs on imports from the European Union, tariffs on imports from Japan, to take two of our strongest allies, tariffs on imports from those two regions will be above 20% under the president's plan. This has been greeted quite poorly by investors. As we're recording this, all the major U.S. stock indices are down quite a bit. This would have a really bad effect on the economic outcomes of workers and households and businesses. I estimate that, depending on the specifics and on implementation issues, this would constitute a tax increase of $400 or $500 billion this year on American households and on businesses. That's a huge amount of money. The combination of a big increase in taxes and the fact that these tariffs would increase the prices of imported goods that households face would mean that households very likely could see negative income growth in the middle of 2025 relative to where their incomes were in the middle of 2024 a year ago. That really could lead households to slam the brakes on their spending. That alone would risk a recession in the United States. If you add on the fact that these tariffs are going to lead businesses to halt their spending, if you add on the fact that other nations are going to retaliate against U.S. exporters, and that's going to hurt our exports, the risk of recession from the policies the president announced is very, very real.
Michael, we're only a couple of months into the Trump administration, and President Trump, in my view, probably won that despite a high stock market with President Biden and his Vice President Kamala Harris, despite very, very low unemployment figures, Americans still have this anxiety about the economy, about their place in it, and about inflation. And so when you look at the fact that that was probably the driver of President Trump's success, help me understand why the anxiety Americans are now being subjected to from what you just described is smart politics.
Well, I don't think it is smart politics, but I think the president does. And look, I think President Trump is a true mercantilist. The president believes that if the U.S. is running a trade deficit, then that means that we are losing economic value to the rest of the world. And that's not the right way to think about international commerce. The president's analysis is wrong, but I do think it's genuinely held. You can go back and watch interviews of President Trump from as far back as the 1980s, where he's talking about his views on international commerce, his views on trade deficits, and they haven't changed. So this, I think, is a genuinely held, though incorrect, view the president has. He thinks that if he jacks up trade barriers, that will reduce the trade deficit. He thinks that if the trade deficit is reduced, that means that Americans will be producing more here at home, and he thinks that that will enrich the United States relative to our current situation. He's wrong about all that, but he does believe it. And so I think he believes this is going to work. He believes this is going to be good politics. I think quite the opposite is going to happen. I think you're going to see consumer prices increase. You're going to see manufacturing employment decrease. You're not going to see much change in the trade deficit at all. You're going to see the unemployment rate go up. You're going to see the president's approval rating go down. And I suspect that a lot of that's going to come as a shock to the president.
Let me put myself in the position of trying to understand some of the president's logic for a moment. And if you look down the list of nations, and every nation on the world, even territories that are not nations are on there, which we'll get to in a moment. But when you look at it, you see everyone has been charged a 10% tariff that exports to the United States. But many of them are higher, and the rationale for those is that they're reciprocal tariffs, that we're meeting other nations' tariffs on the United States, and we're meeting them at that level to establish reciprocal tariffs. Let me just argue, why not do that? Why are we not knocking down barriers for American exporters by charging them the same that they are charging U.S. exports?
Yeah, well, I guess the first thing to say is that a lot of the numbers that the White House has put out are not accurate. And so the president's arguing, for example, that the U.S. faces a tariff rate from the EU, that the EU tariffs are exports to them at over 30%. Divide by 10, and you have something that's a little bit closer to the true number. Why is the president wrong, in a deeper sense about mercantilism? You can kind of understand the logic, right? The president has been critical of the fact that the U.S. imports lumber from Canada, and I think the way the president thinks about this is, American businesses are buying lumber from Canada. That lumber could be produced in the United States. We have lumber here as well. Instead of American businesses paying Canadian companies, why aren't American businesses paying American companies? And if we had a better deal with Canada, if it were harder for us to import from Canada, then American businesses would be buying more lumber from Americans, and that money would stay here and would accrue to the benefit of American lumber producers, not Canadian lumber producers. There's an intuition to that. I teach economics, and a lot of students kind of have this view of how international commerce works, and you have to help them to see why it's wrong. The reason it's wrong is because by importing goods from abroad, that frees up American workers to do higher value-added activities. In the United States today, the average wage of a services sector employee is higher than the average wage of a manufacturing employee. And that's because service sector employees are more productive and they're able to command higher wages. The U.S. should be happy about that. We're able to import goods from abroad that are made by workers abroad who are earning lower wages than workers in the United States. That frees up American workers to do higher paying jobs that require more skill and that are more productive. If the U.S. had a 20% unemployment rate or something like that, then I think there might be more to be said for the view, why are we importing when we have unemployed workers here in the United States who could be put to work. Even in that context, I think the mercantilist logic is wrong. But in an economy like we have, where we have around 4% unemployment, unemployment's not going to be able to go much lower. And so it's not an issue of, Americans are looking for work but can't find it. Why are we relying on workers in other countries? Instead, pretty much everybody who wants a job in America has a job, and those jobs are higher paying than the jobs that President Trump wants to bring back to the United States. There are other reasons we shouldn't be concerned about the trade deficit as well, but I think that's the one that really is the best direct response to the way the president views international trade and international commerce.
Michael, I want to play a clip for you of President Trump talking about how globalization screwed America.
For years, hardworking American citizens were forced to sit on the sidelines as other nations got rich and powerful, much of it at our expense. But now it's our turn to prosper, and in so doing, use trillions and trillions of dollars to reduce our taxes and pay down our national debt, and it'll all happen very quickly.
So what are your thoughts on that? Is this going to be a giant revenue raiser to change the debt position of the United States, to create givebacks to American taxpayers that are funded by these tariffs?
I think the president is right that the tariffs he announced would raise a lot of revenue. Tariffs are taxes on imported goods, and the revenue that these tariffs would be raised in a regressive manner. So these import taxes would hit working class households harder than higher income households. And so for a president who is so focused on the working class, it's a pretty odd way to raise revenue. But he's right that it would raise revenue, and he's right that we have a problem with our structural deficit, and raising revenue would help to address that problem. Now, the president's also going to try to cut taxes in 2025. Those tax cuts are going to disproportionately go to households in the top half of the income distribution. The taxes on imports are going to be disproportionately borne by working class Americans. So if you look holistically at the effect of both the president's trade policies and income tax policies, what you would see is, a lot of revenue coming disproportionately from working class households from the import taxes, tax cuts for the high income Americans, and the net effect on the U.S.'s fiscal situation would be relatively minor.
So the divide grows. Look, you've talked a little bit about America's new mercantilism, and the biggest mercantilist country I know is probably China. But the U.S. position for essentially since the Bretton Woods system was set up, is essentially to be a proponent of globalization, lower tariffs and barriers, kind of moving that. The United States benefited more than every nation in the world in a system where we were pursuing lower and lower and lower trade barriers. Is America now becoming China, becoming more like China in that sense? And are we rejecting the entire Bretton Woods established order?
I do think that the United States, both through trade policy and also through other geopolitical decisions made by President Trump, is walking away from the post-World War II liberal international order. And that's going to accrue to the detriment of Americans and people around the world.
Let me ask you, something here about some numbers that we have. I want to show a chart on the expectations of Americans about Trump's policies and what it will do to them financially. And I think it's directly related to something you've written. In January, 42% of Americans thought Trump policies were going to make them better off. 28% were going to make them worse off. They're about the same, about 30%. The real change is those now see that they are about 23%. So there's been a big, big decline even before these tariffs hit. Worse off, people feel it can be 42%. So Donald Trump is essentially losing the enthusiasm of a lot of people about his strongest suit, which was how to manage the economy. This was something that's really out there. So if you were on, the president's political economic advisory team, what would you be warning him right now? And you kind of did. You wrote a Financial Times article called, it's an economic emergency for Americans. Let's hear about that.
Yeah, I mean, if I had half an hour with President Trump, I would tell him that his policies are going to raise the prices that American consumers face, that his policies are going to increase the costs of producing goods in the United States, that his policies are going to reduce manufacturing employment, that his policies are going to increase the unemployment rate more broadly, that his policies are going to create the real risk that the economy enters a recession in 2025, and that the goal of economic policy should be to increase prosperity, not to decrease prosperity, and that his policies are a threat to prosperity. I think I would also tell him that that's not going to be popular, and that if he wants Congress to successfully extend the expiring provisions of his 2017 tax cuts this year, he needs to reverse course. If he wants Republicans to do well in the 2026 midterm elections, he needs to reverse course. And if he wants a Republican to win in 2028, he needs to reverse course.
Well, let's talk about that for a minute. When you kind of look at the question of how Donald Trump has acted before, he's laid out extreme positions and often modified them and come back. So when he is getting these political signals, is it easy for him to suspend and change? Because in my experience with tariffs, Michael, you and I have been talking for years about this. I've been watching trade policy for years and years. Once a tariff goes into place, once a sanction goes into place, it takes a long time to get them back. But is this reversible?
Yeah, I think this is reversible, and I think the president could reverse it pretty easily. We've already seen him reverse a lot of stuff. I mean, he, in early March, put in place a 25% tariff on all imports from Canada. Then the next day, he exempted automobiles in the auto sector. The day after that, he exempted goods covered under the USMCA free trade agreement between the U.S., Canada, and Mexico. And so President Trump has already shown an ability to pivot and to modify his trade policies. And I suspect we're going to see the same thing with these policies as well.
Let me ask you a question about prices, just to kind of put this in context for people. I don't know if you have kids. I don't have kids, but I buy other people's kids. And if I bought a $10 toy that says made in China, what's it going to cost?
Well, I think it's hard to say, given that we don't really know all the specifics. But I think that toy from China that used to cost $10 could pretty easily cost $15. It could cost 16 or 17 bucks. And that's, a whole lot more. People will notice that.
Gold has gone through the roof. Last time I looked, it was close to $3,200 an ounce. A huge jump in precious metals. Usually that's a haven when there's anxiety about other markets. And I know you well enough that I'm not going to ask you where the markets are going. But when you see the abandonment of traditional equities out there and jumping into precious metals, is that an indication that lots of people are jumping ship?
Yeah, people are jumping ship. You're seeing capital flow out of the United States and into Europe. As you say, you're seeing capital flow out of equities and into gold. The companies that are going to be hit particularly hard are those that are most exposed to taxes on imports. So you're going to see retailers hit hard. You're going to see tech companies with complicated supply chains hit hard. You are going to see companies that rely on steel and aluminum imports hit hard. We've already seen real economic consequences from the threat of these tariffs. The steelmaker Cleveland-Cliffs, the Ohio-based company, last week laid off 1,200 workers as a consequence of the tariffs, and that's before President Trump's Liberation Day announcement was made, and obviously before the Liberation Day tariffs were actually enacted. And so this is bad. Investors are reacting to an environment where U.S. companies are going to be less competitive and where their earnings and profits are going to be lower as a consequence of this trade war.
But, when you kind of look at that moment, a lot of people said, oh, President Trump is hearing about the negative impacts, negative sentiment, concern about Social Security, et cetera, going on in the country. Do you think that's right? Is the president actually hearing? Because it seems to me remarkable that if that was his concern about negative sentiment, that he would then unleash all of these sanctions, which I think is also unleashing a lot of negative sentiment.
Yeah, I mean, I think it's important to keep in mind that President Trump genuinely believes that the tariffs that he announced will be good for the United States. Now, he's wrong about that, but I think it is a genuine belief. And so he's not intentionally trying to immiserate the nation. He thinks this is going to be good for the nation. And I think he has shown a responsiveness to public opinion. The incident where he took away Mr. Musk and Doge's ability to fire workers in executive departments and said that authority rests with cabinet secretaries is an indication that the feedback about Doge was reaching him. The fact that Doge looks to be winding down and Mr. Musk looks to be leaving the administration, I think, is evidence that the feedback about Doge is reaching the president and he's willing to change course. The fact, as we just discussed, that he walked back the extensiveness of his tariffs on Canada, I think, is evidence that he was responsive to concerns he heard from auto executives, and that he was responsive to other concerns he heard. There was not a big announcement made about additional increases in tariff rates on imports from Mexico and Canada as part of President Trump's Liberation Day announcement. I think that indicates that the president is aware that public sentiment about those tariffs is pretty negative. And so I think this is going to be a learning process for the president and for the White House. And I do expect that he's going to walk a lot of this back relatively quickly as he learns how unpopular this is going to be.
I always appreciate our conversations. Georgetown University professor of public policy and director of economic policy studies at AEI, Michael Strain, thanks so much for being with us today.
Thank you for having me.
So what's the bottom line? Only one of two things is going to turn out to be true. The first is President Donald Trump is an economic genius who just traded away $30 trillion of U.S. national wealth to get some tariffs reduced around the world and to kickstart massive new manufacturing investment in the United States. Or on the other hand, the world just witnessed one of the most self-destructive presidential acts in American history. Behind the scenes, members of his own Republican Party are screaming, as are business leaders, world leaders, and a lot of regular Americans who invested their savings in the stock markets. This is a huge gamble. Trump is hitting the pocketbook of everyone, not just the top 1% who could care less how much food or cars cost. But either way, he's got one thing right. The so-called Liberation Day is going to go down in history. But whether it punctuates the dramatic end of America's king of the hill status in the global economy, or it starts something very different and new, is anyone's guess. And that's the bottom line.